Hi, Tim here, and welcome back to another full-length watercolor demo, this time all about how to capture the light. This is the back beach in Teignmouth in Devon in the UK. The photograph was taken late in the day, late afternoon. We've got the light coming towards us, so it's almost contre jour. We have lots of silhouetted shapes of those boats in the water, lots of reflected light on the water surface in the distance in that middle ground there. We can see little bits of light reflecting off the rooftops on the far side of the river. And then as we come towards us, loads and loads of boats to deal with, to handle. This video is also going to be about composition and little bits to leave out, things to include, things to move. The dimensions of my photo, it's widescreen, it's 16:9. I'm painting in a 4:3 format that you'll see shortly. So I'm having to condense the scene a little bit, crop off a bit of the left, a bit of the right. I'm going to choose to remove a few of the boats. For example, this boat here, almost in that bottom left corner. I think it's a bit distracting, and I'm going to have a nicer balance of boats in almost like a fan shape pattern coming across the beach there, with this being the biggest boat. I'm going to remove these boats on the right hand side. I'm going to simplify and reduce some of the boats in the water there in the distance, and I'm going to include a figure. I think a figure would be good around about here. Might look quite nice, a darker figure against the lighter tarpaulins. So I'm going to go through the complete painting process with you, starting off with a description of my materials and going to the drawing stage. Then I'll go through a wash and various watercolor techniques, trying to get, obviously with watercolor, we're working from light to dark. So we're starting off with the lighter values first, and we're gradually getting darker and darker. And also adding in the details, trying to get a bit of the texture of the beach as well, with those little rocks and shells and so on, catching the light, bit of shadow behind them. And then at the end, I'll wrap up with a bit of a self-critique, just to try and summarize where I've got to and things that went quite well and things that maybe could be addressed in the next time I do a scene similar to this. So let me dive into the painting process then, starting off with the materials. First of all, paper is Saunders Waterford cold press paper, 300 grams in weight or 140 pounds, and it's 15 inches by 11 inches. Paints I'm using are handmade professional grade paints. I will describe the colours when I get into painting proper, but they are professional handmade paints from Mark Chapman in the UK. Details in the description. First of all, then the drawing. I would scrub my brush as well when I get onto the painting process again. First of all, getting in that all-important drawing. I've rectified in my mind the composition I want to follow. I haven't done a thumbnail sketch. I'm often asked about, do you do a thumbnail sketch? Do you do a value sketch before doing the painting? Well, no, I don't. It's sort of all in my head and just comes with a little bit of practice. As you can see, I started pretty much in the top left corner. Sometimes I might start with the focal point, generally in that middle area of the paper. This time, top left corner. Get in, first of all, the horizon line, the far side of the river, the estuary here, and then gradually working from top left to bottom right, getting in those quite simple shapes of those boats, trying to have a pleasing sort of balance of shapes. I'm pretty much copying or following the lead of the source photo with these boats in that middle area just before the shoreline, trying to connect these different shapes as well, have different types of boats, not generally having boats that are actually right at the side of the composition. I mentioned that boat in the bottom left-hand corner, the biggest boat on the beach. To me, it just doesn't look right when it's sort of half on, half off. For me, I want to try and get everything included, all of the boat shapes included, and not cut off on the side. Now, coming down to the shoreline, that attractive pattern of boats coming down to the bottom right-hand corner, and fairly simple boat shapes, trying to get the perspective right of the boats. Generally with these boats at this sort of angle, the far side of the boat tends to be a fairly straight line, and then the near side of the boat, that's where you get that curve, quite a big curve coming towards the bow and less of a curve towards the flat stern. So trying to get those boat shapes right, connecting them as well, thinking about where the lights will be and the darks will be. The pencil I'm using is just an ordinary mechanical HP pencil with I think the size of it is a 0.5 millimeters, something like that. So it's not really thin, but it's dark enough so that hopefully as I go through and lay down various washes, I'll still be able to see the pencil outline. Now this is quite an important boat in that bottom right corner, sort of like a full stop at the end of the sentence. That's where things end, on that bottom right corner, getting in the bottom of the boat. That again, a few more curves to deal with in that bottom right corner. Then we've got a couple of boats now in between those last two. A smaller one here, there's that straight edge up to the bow, a little bit more of a curve nearer side to me, and back to the straight edge. The bow on this one it's not strictly speaking vertical, but I think that sort of looks okay. And then behind it is a slightly larger boat with a cabin. That's going to be quite a useful thing to connect the water with the shoreline objects on those two areas, and that boat just to the top right corner of that cabin as well. I think it's a nice bit of connection there as well. I'm not going to draw in all of the smaller details, and I tend not to. In a harbour type scene like this, I tend not to draw in things like masts as well, because invariably with a very thin line like that, they're going to show through into the end painting. So I'll paint them in nice and fresh. So that's the drawing done, basically, trying to get in those main shapes. Just remove my wet sponges to reveal my mixing areas. Yes, so paints are from Mark Chapman in the UK, M-A-R-C for Mark, and they are normal colours for me. From the top is neutral tint, then I got burnt umber, burnt sienna, then yellow ochre, spring green, Virgin green, cobalt green, cerulean blue, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, cadmium red, light red, cadmium orange, cadmium yellow, and a bit of lavender going across the bottom now, a bit of lavender, and over on the right hand side, lemon yellow gouache and some white gouache. More on that later on. First of all though, lavender, I'm using quite a lot of lavender at the moment, but laying in this very light sky with a mixture of light and soft edges. There's that quite nice shape of a cloud I spotted, that the sun is just above that cloud. The cloud is really light, and then below that, that's where the light is on the water surface. And I'm going to continue down over the hills on the far side of the river, this same blue, and I'll be going over this with greens and darker blues later on. But this will be, a lot of this will be the eventual colour of some of the rooftops. Those rooftops I want very light, then I'm going to leave the paper unpainted. But some of the lighter buildings, they will be that sort of lavender blue, that sort of warmish, lightish, opaquish blue, if I could describe it like that. So sky pretty much done. Continue the painting over the far side, negatively painting around some of these rooftop shapes. Cobalt blue and a bit of burnt sienna. Now for the water. Starting from the far side of the estuary, it's a little bit darker on the left-hand side. Now, an important part of this process is trying to capture the light of the sun reflecting on the water. And I'm going to try and use the rough texture of the paper and the brush at a certain angle and not too much paint on the brush. So you can see here, just very lightly dragging it across in that horizontal direction, and then again from the other side, using the rough texture of the surface to hopefully leave behind a few of those little glistening marks. And then as I come lower down, I can get a little bit more solid. I'm going over these boats because they're going to be darker objects, darker values. So I don't mind going completely over those. As I come to the shoreline, I'm going to go a little bit darker, just a tiny bit darker. So to do this, I could, of course, add in some darker paint, bit of a burnt sienna, neutral tint possibly, or just thickening up the combination, changing the ratio, the combination of paint to water. So more paint and less water. I've painted around the top of the boat that's floating in the water, just above where my brush is now. Leave the top of that unpainted because that's going to have a little bit of light hitting the gunnels, the sides of that boat. Coming down now to the beach, and the beach at Teignmouth. Apologies if I pronounced it incorrectly. That the sand there is a lovely, warm, rich red colour, but on the actual shoreline, the water's edge, there's a little bit of like algae or blanket weed, and that's given that a bit of a sort of green tinge, little bits of pebbles down there and shells as well. But as I get past that area of green, it changes this red, this lovely warm red colour, with just a little bit of coolness in it here and there. So a bit of spring green, a nice bright green. If it's too bright, then add in a little bit of a brown or a bit of viridian green. Just adjusting that colour a little bit. It's a bit of a cooler green on the left-hand side. Then it becomes quite bright in the middle, where the sun is coming directly towards us. That's where this green strip is a little bit brighter. So go a bit brighter. Now, careful painting around these all-important boats, trying to preserve the light of those boats. And this is where the drawing is very important, particularly for boat shapes. Over the other side of the boat with the cabin, and then continue over to the right-hand edge. That's still quite wet. The shoreline was still a little bit wet as well, so that there will be a bit of a gentle, soft edge between the water, the sea, and that green strip. Coming towards me, there's this, again, a soft transition, a gradual transition from the green to the sand of the beach, and some subtle variations in the colours in that beach, different reds, cooler reds, blues. Now I've observed on the scene, there's lots of these little pebbles and shells and things catching the light, which are quite pronounced when the light is coming towards you. They stand out a lot more, these lighter, I think there's seashells, a lot of seashells on this beach. Going with this red, of course with watercolor, things dry a lot lighter, so I need to compensate by painting darker, going a bit darker, like another level, going another level of darkness beyond what it's hopefully going to turn out like, because you'll see this in a minute when it dries. Painting around the bottom of these boats, you can see just above in this middle area here, the red is it's going against gravity. There's a bit of a slope on my board, and it's going against gravity and giving me that soft transition right over to this right hand side, connect with the green strip around this very important boat on the right hand side here. And there are some fenders on this boat which I didn't actually draw in, but I'm going to make a mental note there to paint around those. So that's that fender on the right hand side, and I just need to do something in a similar way on the right hand side. So I didn't draw these in, but just the end of that fender, a little bit of an incursion of that red into the side of the boat, and then down to the bottom of that fender, around the bottom of the boat. Bit of a curve there of that boat. Bottom of the boat down to the pointy bit, and then continue. Now notice my brush stroke technique, sort of just dabbing the paper. And this was featured in my recent video, the 6 Ds of watercolor. We're in the daubing stage here, D for daubing. We're dabbing on paint on the paper, whereas we're essentially covering up most of that paper, except for those areas that are going to be light or white, or they're going to be painted in a certain way. Like I did the water above with the sun glistening on the surface, quickly moving the side of the brush across the surface of this roughish paper presents a few little marks there. If there's too many, I can just do a little bit more daubing or dabbing just to paint over some of those whiter areas. And continue down to the bottom left corner. There we go, nearly done. So that's all dried quite nicely. I did speed up things with a hairdryer. Now back to the background, and as I said before, working from light to dark, trying to get a sense of depth into the composition with, on the right hand side, the sort of right hand side of the river here and the distant hills. Quite light. The paper is dry in the back. Coming towards us, you might be able to see in the source photo, which I show now and again, the bridge that connects the two sides of the town on the left, town on the right, and there's a bit of light beyond that, the river as it goes sort of in a northerly direction. Do that in a minute. Just dab in a little bit of darker colour on the right hand side, which is closer to us, and keep it quite light in the distance. And then now to the left hand side. The town on the left with the rows of houses towards the shoreline, but above those houses there are fields and woods, trees, some of the trees silhouetted against the sky. Quite dark in the distance, but I don't want to go too dark, otherwise I'll lose the sense of depth. I want to still try and push things back a little bit. So maybe keep a little bit lighter than the source photo. Paint around some of the buildings and rooftops that I want to keep light. The brush I'm using is a Tintoretto soft synthetic brush. This is their series 1407 and it's a size 6 brush. I guess it's about 10 millimeters in diameter, this brush, and in my opinion a very good brush. It's got a good point to it, it holds a lot of water, and it's got a lovely flat edge that I'm utilizing right now to paint in a fairly controlled way, painting in these areas of blues and greens, but painting around, getting that sharp edge, having that using the edge of this brush just to get in painting the edges of the rooftops at a sort of, you've got to think about with these rooftops, the buildings are angled a little bit away from us, so we're sort of looking obliquely at the buildings, and they're sort of have these almost like diamond type shapes rather than a rectangular shape. So we're coming down to these rows of houses now. If I accidentally paint over too many of the houses on the far side, I can always go in with some white paint towards the end and just add in a few more highlights over there. And this background will be pretty much done from a point of view of the main application, apart from a little bit of darkness for the rooftops. There are these, so the hills, they sort of come down, they flatten out, they level out towards the shoreline, and then we've got a succession of rooftops, generally soft, darker lines, horizontal lines of those rooftops. So I need to make sure the background here is quite dry before I do that, otherwise it'd be too soft. Getting a bit of blue here, lavender of the middle buildings. Also, as I come down to the shoreline, I don't want a straight edge to the shoreline. I want a sort of jagged edge and like a sort of stepped pattern over the water's edge where the higher bits of the paper unpainted will become the tops of boats, the tops of these silhouetted boats that are just fairly simple rectangular shapes in a way. So I just need to think about that with some of the edges of the shoreline. Go a bit warmer now for the far side. There's a little bit of a beach and the middle of the river that's exposed at low tide. Yeah, I should have said I think this is pretty much low tide here because we can see that middle bank of sand, which the open part of the river is to the right, and then that area of sand there extends over to the left to the town on the far side. Just continue a little bit over, thinking about retaining or leaving out some of the paper unpainted. That's going to be the tops of those boats yet to be painted. Cobalt blue. And a little bit of burnt sienna in there. But cobalt blue for some of the darker reflections on the water. So again, using this brush, very versatile. I've got some quite narrow lines. It's darker on the left-hand side, so some darker waves and a bit of the reflection of the distant hill and woodland. Just continue over to the right hand side, into the middle, over to the right. Again, I've gone over those boats in the middle because they're going to be a lot darker, and then connect. Keep thinking about connecting, coming in from that right hand side as well. I'm actually painting here over the tape along the side of the paper, just so that when I peel off the paper, it's going to leave a nice crisp edge. Just cover up that little bit of a white patch there by the side of the tape. Continue over the left-hand side. Use my finger tips if I want to quickly get a softer edge or do a little bit of lifting of the paint as well. Okay, now I need to get in that bridge in the distance in the background there. Just covering that, just checking if it's dry. Just covering the bottom of the background hills, skirting along the shoreline there. Just basically a very simple bridge. Small brush now and fairly thick paint. Drag over. It actually doesn't need to be a continuous line. Sometimes a line like this might be good if it's broken in the middle, just a sort of lost and found line, almost like a sequence of dashes. Few vertical supports, doesn't matter if they're equally spaced. And that's pretty much that bridge done. Now back to the foreground, and we have these white shapes of the boat in the foreground, which I need to, first of all, I'm going to add some darker values to the tarpaulin covers on them. So there's a blue one here, of course lighter colour first. I'll let that dry a bit before putting in the little folds on the tarpaulin up to the edge of the red one, which is to the right of it. So cameo red, a little bit of alizarin crimson. It's not bright red, it's sort of a light cool red, I reckon. Remembering it is going to dry a little bit lighter, so compensate by going in a bit lighter than you think. Leaving a few little white areas where, again, the light, trying to think about capturing the light, the sunlight in the distance, bouncing off that, just that right angle, a shiny surface like a tarpaulin cover, and just a few little shapes there of light, of white paper. And then, again, like the blue one, I'll go in with, when that's dry, I'll go in with some darker values for the folds. Cabin of the little boat right on the shoreline. Bit of light above it. Thinking about the light bouncing off there. That probably is going to be quite bright there because the sun is directly behind in a line from where I am. Not a perfect edge. Introduce a few little variations in that edge. It's a case now of just completing the process for the other boats. The tops of the boats or any shadows within the boats, and then painting in the hulls, and immediately after that the shadow, dark shadow going up the beach, basically to the left, those on the left, and then the big boat here, that shadow will go pretty much towards me. In the photograph, it's actually just a little bit to the right. I think I'll just avoid that. I'll avoid going over the right-hand edge. If I copied the shadow shape in the photo, I'd be going off the side of the paper, which as I said at the beginning, I want to try and avoid that. A little bit of wet in wet there, adding in a little bit of darker value where there's just a little bit of a depression in the tarpaulin cover. Now that tarpaulin cover is not as shiny as the other one, so that's where I could get away with that wet in wet. Very few lighter areas, although it is a little bit lighter on the right hand side, but it sort of looks okay. Boat on the left hand side, shadow on the side of the boat, and I picked up a little bit of white gouache there just to make it a bit thicker, the paint, just a little bit more opaque-ish, and going up pretty much to the blue tarpaulin of the boat next to it. They are a very similar value. It's just bleeding a little bit, so pick up a tissue, just lift off a little bit of that paint, and that's also serving to dry up that blue tarpaulin cover which is all right because that's where I'm lifting off is towards the light. So it's just bring off, just making that area a little bit lighter. Bit of darkness to the next boat to it, the blue boat. Again, it is going to dry lighter than that. And now red boat, go a good bit darker, pick up a bit of cadmium red, ultramarine blue. And there's a little bit of light right on this right-hand side of this boat, so I don't need to touch the light red of the tarpaulin cover, but just continue with this darker color. Well, now it's just starting. This is now just starting to give us the feeling of an extra light in the scene, particularly in this foreground area here. It's gonna actually increase in that perception with the addition of the darker shadows. These shadows are a lot darker than the actual boats themselves. Make that a solid shadow, shady side of that boat. Now, at the start of these shadows, just a little bit of a shadow going off the left-hand side from that furthest boat, doesn't matter. And then this next one got a little bit too much paint that's accumulated to the bottom. I want to keep the shady side of the boat damp, and then when I add in the darker, thicker shadow up to it, it's going to gently merge between them, so I get a nice soft transition between the two. Even with the board on a slope, the paint, the darker paint, is going to go up against gravity. Use a little bit of fingertip just to adjust the value there. Just lift off a little bit where I see fit. Now, one of the main boats here. Dark shadow, and thinking about the shape of the bow as it curves round to the keel, and start of that shadow, nice and dark. Shadow is the cast shadow from this boat is a similar value to the shady side of this red boat, excluding that white line that I'll put in later on, the white line going along the side of the boat. Yeah, so similar value. And the edge of that shadow needs to be quite irregular because we're trying to create the impression of the texture of the beach, the contour of the beach, lots of pebbles and slight. It's not completely level, the beach. Down to, or over to, small boat with the cabin. Down to the bottom of that boat, painting carefully around the back of this boat here. Now, this one it's shady on this side, but it's got a bit of reflected light. I think it's generally a sort of cream, it's like a sort of creamy boat, yet it's got a fair bit of reflections, light reflections coming into it from the beach, or maybe the boat to its right-hand side. So I don't want to go too dark with this one. dark shadow, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, burnt sienna. Again, going up to the hull and letting them bleed to each other. A little bit of too much of an ingression of that darker value. So just mop it up again. And then over to the fender on the blue boat. Use my fingertip just to soften up that edge. And the shadow from the cabin of the boat with the cabin, and that's coming over to the bluish boat on the right. Yes, gradually taking shape now. Adding in these darks really makes the difference. The hull of this boat on the right is a sort of turquoise colour, so I've got my cobalt green and a bit of light. It's actually a little bit, this hull is a bit darker at the top and then it's lighter at the bottom just here, so I'll need to lift off some of that. Neutral tint and same combination of colours for the dark shadow up to the hull, little bit of merging, blending of the colours. So this is a thicker consistency than the side of the boat, much thicker, less water. Pick a bit of cobalt blue. It's nice to add a bit of cobalt blue into some car shadows. Just adds a little bit of extra interest and dimension to them. Nearly up to that fender on the right hand side. Jagged edge to the side of the shadow. Some thicker paint just to strengthen the bottom of that middle boat, just where it meets its car shadow, and lift off while the paint is still quite damp. Just lift off in a few places. This tissue is, ideally, it's just a little bit damp because then you don't get the texture of the crumpled up tissue. Just a little bit damp. It's still going to lift off the paint. And then just a smaller shape to lift off that light hitting the very front of this boat. So I'm sort of shaping the tissue for the sort of best size, just to lift off that paint. All right, check the middle ground now. Prior to adding in the boat, all these boat shapes, that's another major area that I need to focus on, all these quite simple boat shapes in that middle ground. Right, lavender, burnt sienna, quite thick, bit of cobalt blue. Good bit of mixing, make sure it's well and truly mixed. Check the edge on my brush. And now, careful, me being right-handed, got to be careful not to smudge. Ideally, I would have let that dry down the bottom, but you can see just a little bit of glistening. Some of those shadows, the car shadows, are still quite damp. All of these connected shapes then in the middle ground. And some of the lighter areas near the shore, they're going to serve as lighter parts of the tops of the boat. So I'm just really working from left to right with the flat edge of my brush. Not too dark, some of these boats. Not too dark, some of these boats. A few distant ones in there. And this is where I'm greatly simplifying and just creating the impression in a fairly loose way, the impression of all of those boats in that middle ground going over to the far side of the river. Keep checking the edge of my brush. Could actually have done this with a smaller brush, but for keeping the momentum going, I'm just sticking with this medium-sized mop brush. Just impression of a few little small boats there, which, of course, in that light area, you're not going to see them as a complete rectangle. The light will just sort of interfere and obscure some of the shapes of the boats. Little boat. Now there's a nice, to me it looks like a fishing boat on this left-hand third, which I think is a nice balance there. There's the smart sort of cruiser yacht on the right-hand third. And then we've got this small little typical traditional fishing boat with a cabin quite a bit to the front. So a bluish hull for this one, and then a reddish cabin. Might be sort of some sort of varnished wood maybe, and windows, the frames in like that. To strengthen up the hull a bit. Straight edge for the bow, hard edge. Little buoy in the water just in front of it, and reflection while I'm at it, bit of reflection. So these boats in the middle ground, the ones closest to us, they will have more of a reflection than the ones in the distance. If you look at the source photo, the ones in the distance will have no reflections at all. They're just shapes sitting there on the water, but those closest to us. And I guess that's going to give us a feeling of a bit of the depth again, and a bit of movement in the water with the gaps between some of these horizontal lines. So I'm using just the tip of my Tintoretto mop brush here. Darken up the left-hand side a bit more. So this is like a third application of these reflections on that left-hand side. Something is disturbing the water way over to the left maybe. I'm just actually here using the source photo as a bit of guidance over these lines. It's a bit too dark, that one there. Right, we need to add a few more lines in here, just above the boat, just beyond the boat. That's okay. Right, so just a case of continuing along. Left to right, filling in the spaces, creating these shades, a bit of lavender there, quite thick, and cobalt blue. Try and get a nice edge to my brush. And just in there, there's a yacht. I'm just going to turn it a little bit more towards us. Excuse the glare on the paper. So just a few more sort of head-on boats, not rather than looking at the side of them, because of the shorter width of my paper, the different dimensions to the photo. I'm needing to sort of condense the scene a little bit. Sometimes good too, where I've got a grouping of boats like this, it's sometimes good to do the one that's closest to you first. And then, as you can see here, I'm just painting around the ones behind, leaving a little bit of a light edge where the light is catching the top of the previous shape. So just a sequence of connected objects. They don't necessarily need to be completely boat shaped. The ones in the middle, for example, there's probably a shape of the shape of the boats in the middle. There's probably about 4 or 5 boats in that middle area, just to the left of the lighter patch in the middle ground. Right now, this luxury yacht, or this little cruiser, quite a simple shape, and the cabin, the hull, little boat to the right of that, just to even things up a bit. There are 2 or 3 boats over on that right hand side. I'll just have one. Fairly simple shape again. The hull, bit of a cabin on top, light edge between the 2. And now for some reflections of these, which is cobalt green and neutral tint. Cobalt green is always quite a nice colour to start reflections off with, particularly in a bright, sunny seascape or harbour scene. It does work quite well. And I just need to darken it a little bit. The reflections are a little bit darker, of course, than the boats above. Sort of zigzagging down towards me. Just ever so slightly a larger gap between those lines as we come closer to us. Bit more solid next to the object, but then you see there just a little bit wider space as we come towards us. This one I can connect to, the reflections of this one I can connect to the boat that I haven't put in yet. That sort of it's a warmish colour to this boat, just down to the top of it. Then a few here on the right hand side for that one. There we go. And now just in the distance to the right hand side of the light patch, very simple shapes of boats there, just over by the sandbar. No reflections. connect with the sandbar as well, with some of those. Keep dabbing into the boats just with a little bit of extra colour, just adds in some extra dimensions. Right now we've got the inside of this boat, trying to preserve that light edge on for the tops of this boat. So a nice thin darker shape for the inside of the boat. And then the hull, warm. Picked up a bit of cadmium orange. Connect with the cabin of the boat on the beach up to the bow. Nice sharp edge, hard edge, and back to the cabin. I can connect it I can connect with that cabin just a little bit, and then the reflections. It's always best to do these reflections right away after putting in the side of the boat. You get that connection between the two. Pay a bit more attention to the reflections and the little waves, little bits of darkness being reflected against the dark side of that boat. So it's beginning to take shape. You know, these shapes, silhouetted shapes. We're contre jour. We're looking into the light, and we just have these basic shapes here. We'll need to, of course, add in a bit of detail to those boats, some markings and darker water lines and a few masts, few verticals, which will serve in connecting the middle ground with the background. Right, let's just get in a figure now. Could have done this with a smaller brush, but I've got this brush in my hand. Right, start with the head, and I hadn't drawn this one in, this figure, so it might go wrong. It might end up being badly placed or too large or too small, but I think it's all right. Start off with the head, which you can always make larger if necessary, and then the body. Sometimes with the head, I think, when I put the head in, I think, is that figure walking from left to right, right to left? Now, where it is there, just left of the center line, I think it would look better, the figure walking into the composition. And let's give the figure a dog, walking the dog here, which is a fairly common sight you would see on this beach. I'm not sure if that the dogs aren't allowed on the beach during the summer months. Maybe I'm right by saying that. Anyway, so this might be more of a out of season month. Very simple dog shape. Add in some darker values. That background is actually still a little bit damp, which is good, because then when I'm applying the colours, I'm going to get a soft edge. I'm not going to get a hard edge, but a few darker shapes, darker trees, little verticals, just adds a bit more interest to that background. Back to my small brush, burnt umber, neutral tint, not too much water on the brush, and some darker details to the distant houses, the rooftops mainly. They need to be a little bit darker just to make that distance a bit more looking like a small town there with that long line of buildings on the front, and there's the darker seawall on just below where the houses are, where just the back of the beach on that far side. Bit of a darker line just to create the impression of that retaining seawall. Now I can just tidy up some of these boats in the background there, coming towards the middle ground. Just make the bottoms of the boats a little bit tidier and more of a horizontal line. As well as a darker waterline, sometimes you can make boats better looking when you add in a darker line running along the just below the top edge of the boat for these smaller crafts. That is, you often have that sort of painted line across the top of the boat, and that does just creates an extra sort of sparkle to the boat, as well as this waterline there as well, darker waterline. And it's pretty much dry now, these boats. Careful waterline on that one. Another waterline on this one. A few little bits and pieces at the top, and a few buoys in the water. Of course, with those, I can place them wherever I want to, just to supplement where the boats are gone, just to balance things up a bit. If there's a bit of an empty space, for example, in the harbour area or the sea area, I can fill those in with a few floating objects, few buoys, just to balance things up. We've got a fisherman here in the boat. Maybe pointing, he's just walking. I say he, it could be she, just walking from the cabin to the back of the boat. Just strengthen up some of those lines, solidify, remove those little white spaces. A few more reflections from that boat. Neutral tint. Create these dark water lines for the middle boats. There. Bit of a cabin on that one. Ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson. Hardly any water, almost pure pigment. As you can see, I'm using tube paint, and I always prefer tube paint to hard pans, which to me, the hard pans, they just take too much working, and they can wear out your brushes, and they're not as moist as tube paint. And tube paint you can keep nice and fresh in your palette. As you can see at the start of the video, I had my sponges there in the mixing wells, and then when the lid to the right goes over, that keeps it all enclosed and keeps it nice and moist for the next painting. That can keep moist for many days. Right, a few verticals here. And one there connecting, although it's a lost and found line connecting. Now, a very important mast for this yacht that's just sort of turning, almost facing towards us. I think it's probably pointing over to the right a little bit, but a dark vertical mast just connecting, going up to the sky, connecting the background, connecting the middle ground. An important element to bring it all together, connecting again. And a few more verticals, little tiny verticals here and there, little touches of the brush. cobalt blue for the darker side of the blue tarpaulin, which going up to that, you can see how light that red tarpaulin has dried now. When I put that down, it was quite dark, wasn't it? But now it's a lot lighter. And this being thicker paint, this is going to stay fairly true to as I'm applying it. Here's another dark line across the top of that boat, round to the back. Just darken up a little bit of a triangle there above the blue boat. And likewise a little bit of a triangle, little sort of a slither of darkness there as well. Now these folds in the tarpaulin, just a few key dry brush marks, not much water on the brush. And you get, with the angle of the brush, you get a sort of hard edge one side and a bit of a softer edge the other side, trying to create the impression of those folds, those little ridges in that tarpaulin. Likewise, the red tarpaulin, just a few sort of crescent type shapes, very similar to the shape of the waves in a way. Burnt umber, neutral tint, a little bit of Aladdin crimson, and dry brush mark for that. Just accentuates, just emphasizes the top of that boat. Few little lines of ropes coming down, and a bit of a fender on that right hand side. Now the boat in front of it, just strengthen up that line on the far side, and some darker shapes between the thwarts in the middle of the boat, those sort of seats that are connecting the two sides. A bit of darkness just gives it a bit of extra form and a bit more of a three-dimensional shape. And they don't have perfect size, these boats. It's got a bit of sort of paraphernalia on top of it, the where the oars go. Darker line for this one now. And this one is showing some of the strips, the lines of the timber going down. So I need to be a bit careful with this one. Again, I haven't drawn this in, so I need to be a little bit careful in drawing these curved lines. Just strengthen up that bottom of that tarpaulin. A few ropes connecting the fronts of those boats. Sort of a repeating, in a way, giving a sense of depth to the scene with the distance between these lines, parallel lines. Bit of a rope curled up on the beach. Line running down the top along that side of that middle boat, and then very carefully these lines of the timbers. They're sort of narrow, they've got narrow gaps towards the front of the boat, and it gets a little bit wider, and then towards the back of the boat they get closer together again. Blue boat, back of the tarpaulin. This one's fairly flat actually, this tarpaulin, fairly level. And just where the tarpaulin comes over the top, bit of darkness, particularly on that right hand side. It's a little bit darker on that right hand side. Up to the fenders. We're firmly into the detail stage of the painting. Create a bit of form to those fenders, these circular shapes, almost like cylinders. You get these sort of ball type shapes, don't you, with fenders, and then these are more cylindrical. A few more lines like we did on the boat to the left of the timbers coming up to the bow. And they're a bit more evident, these lines, on the sides of the boat, and then they almost disappear to the middle. Burnt sienna, burnt umber. Bit of a definition to the front of that boat. A little aerial on the cabin. Darker lines on some of these boats just to add a bit more detail to them. Got to be careful here not to overdo things, adding in too much into that middle ground, although it's a sort of focal point, that these shapes and the light beyond it. Don't want to make it too complicated or too busy. And so too the beach, again, return to the beach, adding a bit more detail to the beach and the texture of the sand here. Some of those little white shapes where the paper was left unpainted, I can make those into little bits of debris on the beach, bits of dried seaweed or little shells catching the light, and then just a bit of shadow this side of it will just emphasize it a little bit more and make them more believable, a bit more sort of three-dimensional. Picked a bit of quinacridone gold there. And that line, I think, is a good idea, that line going up to the boat, then disappearing, presumably at the back of the boat or underneath the boat, and then going over the right-hand side, just sort of adds a bit of continuity to that beach. Now there's some softer lines going along the beach, sort of parallel to the water's edge, and then there's these stronger lines of ropes and chains or whatever coming from the boats. Do those in a minute, but we've got those sort of crossing of those different elements. Dry brush mark here for the bits of seaweed, I think, probably marking maybe a bit of a high tide mark, maybe just where that front of the boat is. Dry brush mark. not too much detail in the foreground. I want the focal point to be somewhere in the middle. I'm still not sure what the focal point might be. Maybe it's the light of the water. Maybe it's the light of the cabin on the boat on the shore. Hardly any water in this paint mix. Pick a bit of lavender, go a bit cooler with some of these lines. Start from the shadow, go out. All right, some of these ropes then coming from way over on the left and then going into the scene, and there these lines, they actually go out to some of the boats or buoys. I don't know where they just go into the come up to the shoreline, they sort of disappear below the surface, but they're quite pleasing lines. They sort of serve to draw your eye into the scene and serve also to connect. You need to think about perspective a little bit, but serving to connect and also get a sense of depth as well. So fairly dry brush mark, make it a little bit thicker coming towards me. Continue on there, on that right hand side, another one on that right, on the far right. Got one just dropping down from the front of the blue boat to strengthen up that line a bit more. It's almost vertical, that line. Now for a little bit of white gouache. Now I've got some white gouache in my palette, and it tends to, I find it dries up quite a lot compared to the watercolors. And so I'm having to moisten it a bit and just work it a bit, and then try and get the right sort of thickness. If it's too thick, it goes on like a dry brush mark, which I might want, or if it's too watery, it goes a little bit milky and it will dry darker. So gouache will dry, generally gouache will dry darker, whereas watercolor is drying lighter. So this white, particularly the white on a darker surface. Now with this white paint, fingers crossed, it's just the right sort of consistency. Adding a few little vertical marks there, masks, just catching the light in the distance. Make some of these buoys red in colour and a little bit of reflection from those. Need to add a little bit more white. You can my white gouache down the bottom right corner is breaking up, so it's gone a little bit brittle. Yeah, get rid of that. So it's just exposing a bit more of the white. You can see it's pretty sort of contaminated with other colours, but that's why I need to keep working out with a little bit of water, just mixing it, getting the right kind of consistency. And where these ropes are against a darker background, I can just add that bit of white there, just to emphasize, just shows up just a little bit more. There are just a little bit of light, thinking about the light coming from almost that middle area. Just a bit of highlighting on the ropes coming down from those foreground boats. Some light on the top of the cruiser, light on the figure, bit of light catching the lead, maybe of the dog. Just a few little shells, plus add some lighter little dabs into the shadowy area as well. Just a few shells catching the light. Few little shells in the shadows along the shoreline as well. Although it's mostly covered in that algae stuff. That's a bit of light on the bow of that boat. Strengthen up the ropes a bit more, just as they're coming over the tops of those boats. A few more lines down the shoreline. Just need to make that fold there just a little bit thicker. Ultramarine blue. Strengthen up that line there. Just really now in a phase of completing any final sort of tidying up. A few timbers on that boat, a few more on that one as well, the distant one. I'll keep that top fairly light. A line going out into the water. A few little darker marks, and we're done. All right, a bit of a little critique, self-critique at the end, just to see what went well, maybe what I could improve on next time round. Objective then, capturing the light with a scene, contre jour, and a classic sort of watercolor scene with the foreground boats, the middle ground boats, the background as well. An exercise in composition, trying to get a balance with the scene. I removed the boat that was in the bottom left-hand corner, some of the things going on the right, simplifying the middle ground as well, reducing the number of boats in there, greatly simplifying the background, trying to capture the light on those distant rooftops. Yes, trying to keep it very loose with the definition of the background there, trying to create the shapes of these boats coming out. Very light sky, a little bit of a light cloud. Trying to use dry brush, using the sort of leveraging the roughness of the paper to get that sort of sparkle on the water's surface there. Maybe that could have been, I could have gone a little bit dry with the brush because I got a bit of a hard edge there. So maybe could have gone either hold the brush flatter or less paint in the brush, bit of a dry brush on that surface, and or maybe moving the brush quicker over the surface as well to get that speckled effect. But quite pleased with the foreground, the middle ground boats and those reflections as well, using that mop brush to good effect with the reflection shapes, with quite a bit of gap between those shapes as we come towards us in the foreground. Nice pattern of boats, trying to capture the feeling of light with the light on top of that cabin there, the light on the sides of the boats, the light on that left-hand boat, left unpainted. Could have rubbed out some of the pencil lines just to freshen things up a bit. Yes, so light on the top of the boats, and then the contrast of the dark shadows of the boats. A little bit darker than the shady side of the boats, but look how dark that is. That really does emphasize the feeling of light. And then that warmth, that warm glow. The sand in this part of the world is often quite warm, quite a reddish color with the erosion of the rocks, the reddish rocks that are around the area. Lovely color to that, the lovely warm color to the sand, yet just in a few places, just cooling it down a bit with that lavender down there with the lavender of the line as well. What turned out quite well was the texture on the beach and using those little light areas. The light is coming towards us, so a little bit of shadow behind those lighter areas. Could have done a few more. There's lots of little shapes here that could have been had that process. I got to use that process as well. Just a little bit of a dark spot between. A dark spot this side of those lighter edges, just to give it a bit more form. And then using those lines leading us into the scene, that sort of pattern of lines going across the scene, leading us down to the water's edge. The inclusion of a figure as well, walking the scene, a little bit more interest, and also a figure on that little fishing boat as well. Sense of depth with the value of the distant, that's the right-hand side of the river there. That's the left-hand side. This is the right-hand side. And that bridge, very simple bridge, a little bit untidy there, but it's all right. Sort of random vertical marks for the supports, very loose with the boats there in that middle area, right in the distance before the sandbar. Yeah, quite happy with that scene. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something from it. Give it a go. And certainly if you're on Patreon, you can give it a go. I'll add in my comments as well when you make your posting. This is not one of our monthly projects, it's just one of my ad hoc painting exercises through the month. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. Contre jour, trying to capture the light. Catch up with you on the next video. Bye-bye.